Hi, and welcome to Unplanned, the show about cities and how they work. I'm Sam, your host. Let me remind you to hit the subscribe button for plenty more great conversations to come in the future. Today, we are going to dive into the question of economic development. We have all been experiencing COVID. COVID has had a huge impact on our lives, and it certainly has had a huge impact on our economy, both our national economy, but more importantly, from a planner's perspective, our local economy. Today's guest is a wonderful person who has great and deep insight and some real experience working on these issues. And she is Betsy Cowan Neptune, who is the Chief of Economic Development at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. Betsy, let me welcome you to Unplanned.
Great, thanks for having me, Sam.
So Betsy, let's get into this because you and I were talking just briefly before this. You've just come out with a report, and why don't we start with that? It's a comprehensive report, is my understanding, and it kind of looks at the Boston metro area. I call it SEDS. You would more appropriately call it whatever. Let's get into it. What is it? What's that report all about?
Great. So just for some background for your viewers, first, I'm at a regional planning agency called the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. And our role really is to build the capacity of local governments to plan for the future. And we kind of cover an area of 101 communities. Basically, for Bostonians, that's in the kind of 495 belt. And a lot of our role is really helping the region think about economic development. I previously was at the city of Boston, and when we did economic development, we had a map of Boston, and then there was white space in all the places around Boston. And we kept saying, economic development should be regional. So we really kind of started to think about how do we help different municipalities work together to tackle these broader economic development issues across municipal boundaries. So as part of that, every 5 years, we do a regional strategy for economic development.
Well, let me just pause. Let's just pause there for a second and really highlight that regional component, because I'm really glad you brought that up. That is, of course, an important part, not just of your job, but it's an important part about how we think about all of these interconnected systems. And it's really hard, but maybe you can talk to this, to have an economy that doesn't take into the account the region as a whole. The region interconnects in so many different ways. So I suppose I'm just glad that you took a moment to sort of pause on that. But keep going. Tell us about this report and what you found, what you worked on there.
Yeah, great. So when we started the report, and it was, it's fascinating. I think everyone's going to kind of do a retrospective of last year and how things, how COVID really affected how we were thinking about things. But we started in December 2019, January 2020. And at that point, we laid out 3 big principles that we wanted to build the plan around. So the first was on racial equity, and this is just knowing historically where our region has been, building on the Color of Wealth report that the Federal Reserve did in 2015, really showing the difference between the average net assets of white families versus Black families. So really kind of honing in on racial equity. But then the second was really thinking about economic resilience. And that is really kind of how do you build the capacity of a region to respond and withstand an economic shock. And in January 2020, we kind of said, we're not really sure what an economic shock could look like, but we do want to include this in the SEDS, certainly kind of have diversification of industries, things like that. And then the third was around climate resilience. We're patting ourselves on the back a little bit because those things really over the course of last year really became much more at the forefront. So first, just obviously around the economic resilience.
Well, before we get into the specifics, sure. Just take us back to that moment, January 2020, which is basically a year ago now. The world looked a lot different. I mean, the future looked a lot different back then. Right. And one of the points that I've always made is that COVID allowed us to just not just rethink, but really analyze all our different systems that we've created.
Right, back in January, even before then, right, we had a sense, and you ask anyone kind of in the region, how are things going? You have a sense that it's not working for everyone. And that there are certain sectors, obviously, you think about kind of the service sector or other sectors where there's really persistently low wages and also generally kind of more concentration of people of color. So that was there before, right, in terms of wage equity. The second big thing we started looking at is access to jobs via transit. And if you do a map of the region and you kind of look at these major employment centers, Boston obviously has much more transit access, but then you look north and south, there's major employment centers. And then you map that with where can people afford to live who work in those jobs and where are the transportation lines. And there's a complete mismatch. So we started kind of saying there's some inherent ways that we need to really rethink, even from a land use perspective, where the jobs are located, how are we addressing transit? But then obviously from a housing perspective, this is the big question around affordable housing. So where is there sufficient housing that the people who are working in these jobs can afford? So, and we've talked to employers who have said, honestly, our big challenge, this is pre-COVID, our big challenge is not finding qualified workers. We can train them. They said, but we need to find workers who can consistently get to work and don't have to live an hour and a half away and have reliable transit. So those are kind of some big issues that we started thinking about in January, and then obviously the year.
Well, let's stay in that January timeframe before COVID happened, because of course COVID kind of turned the whole apple cart upside down. But you also might look back at the past decade and sort of gross economic numbers, sort of gross domestic product numbers. The Boston region presumably was in a pretty high charged environment. Certainly the real estate market and the construction market and certain aspects of our local economy were probably by some measures doing pretty well. Spend a little bit, just a minute more on that split between those who are doing well, which might include a high school educated construction worker, as opposed to somebody working in a restaurant.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think if you look at comparable metropolitan areas, we're doing very well. And over the past decade really did well. I think partly one is just obviously, our region has healthcare and education. And so certainly that connection. But especially, as we kind of dug into some more of our analysis, just looking at all the manufacturing that supports the healthcare sector, right? All the kind of advanced manufacturing, and then certainly, obviously, around Cambridge and elsewhere, the defense sector and kind of all, Kendall Square, all of that kind of investment, right? So there was a lot of folks, even obviously that's kind of one educated career pathway, but certainly, techs and other folks that are working in manufacturing had very good career trajectories within kind of the advanced manufacturing sector. But then obviously there's a kind of split, right? Other folks that are in the service sector supporting various industries and even supporting kind of the healthcare and education industries, but really low wages. Think about kind of certified nursing assistants and all of the kind of lower wage positions in the healthcare sector. And then on the other side too, we did a lot of thinking about small businesses, and we can again talk about how COVID impacted those, but looking at the health of small businesses in the region, I'll just say many were marginal even before COVID.
Just to make a point on that, which we'll get to COVID in a second, but of course we have all these old, by American standards, ancient squares. You think of Harvard Square, you think of Davis Square, that are small retail zones. And of course, they've just been wiped out by the internet. I mean, pre-COVID, never mind COVID, how do you adjust to an online world where you can order anything on Amazon? That's a problem, not just community by community, but sub-community by sub-community. These very localized economies of just, where do you go with that?
Right. And, we do a lot of thinking about that because there's kind of two sides for me. So one is, are these businesses generating wealth, like true wealth for the people who run them? And I think in some cases, yes. And there's lots of businesses that have been able to expand and grow, but I think a lot of businesses are just very, very marginal. And so that raises some questions even about kind of the business owners themselves and their kind of financial projections and future. But then the second piece is all this, like the cultural kind of value of these businesses, especially, ethnic restaurants and, the sense of place where you would say, I actually want that business to continue, even if it's not a strong wealth generator for the business owners, because there's something about this cultural wealth. But then it does raise some bigger questions for me around wealth equity and, how do we ensure that these are thriving institutions, not just for their cultural value, but also just for the financial value that they bring to their owners.
All right, so there we are. We're January, February, a year ago.
Yes.
And then we start to hear about this virus that's going to impact our lives. We're not sure exactly how. I think some people thought, well, this is 2 weeks of not going into the office and then we'll be through that. Turned out it was going to be a little bit different than that. Walk us into, and you're in the middle of the process of writing up. And just tell us, SEDS stands for what exactly? What
Yeah,
is
great. We love acronyms in the planning world. So it's the Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy. And by comprehensive, we mean regional, and then the strategy to kind of advance economic development for our region.
Okay, so there we are. COVID's kicking in. Where do you go? Where do you go with all this stuff?
The one thing, we said, do our goals change? Because we had started to, set out some goals. And I actually, I think the goals are the same. It's the strategies of how to get there. So the goals around ensuring that there's, financial stability and security for folks, or increased kind of parity around racial equity. Those goals haven't changed. The strategies are going to be radically different now that we've been through COVID. So our first step was, first just kind of
go ahead. Yeah, take us into it.
So digging into the data, and I'll say consistently, and I think this is true for other folks in the planning world. The data lags. The recent data that we could get around business counts and some of the statistics is 2 years old. So that was one of the frustrating things, is we didn't really, in 2 years we'll know kind of really what the impact of COVID was. So we said kind of what's the kind of on the ground data that we can get. And fortunately, we were doing a number of immediate response projects.
Let me just pause here for a second. So you're trying to take a temperature of what impact COVID is actually having in real time on the economy, basically.
Right. And there's again a lag time, right, of what's reported and what we're aware of. Excuse me. And so we were actually doing a couple projects. This is outside of our big planning process, to respond to the immediate impacts of COVID. So one on small business response, and the second on unemployment. So that started to get us kind of some real-time data around business closures, around unemployment counts, so who's unemployed and what are their options. So then we started to kind of pull that data together along with the macro data that we were using around the region.
And what were you seeing? I mean, give us a sense, because we hear a lot about the macro data, but it's really, these things are very micro at some level.
Yeah, so I'll talk first about small business, and then I'll tackle the unemployment. So on the small business side, we actually worked with a number of communities and did a number of different surveys. And it's not going to be unsurprising, but I think it was something around 90% of the businesses that we surveyed had seen significant revenue losses. One of the things that we were looking at too is their ability to retain staff safely who are also accessing unemployment benefits. So it was a challenge for the businesses to really be sustainable during that time. And then, then we started to hear, what are the responses, and could communities really start to pivot to help these businesses remain open? So I'm happy to talk about some of the work that we're doing there. So that's kind of on the small business side. On the unemployment side, we were fortunate. I know you had my colleague, Sarah Philberg, on. She and her team did really excellent work analyzing unemployment data. And I'll just say kind of a broad, one of our broad goals here too is accessing more data from the state and other sources. And we're pleased that there was more data that started to come out, particularly around unemployment. So we were able to start to track by municipality, fortunately, how many people were unemployed. And that really
let's just spend a second on that. And this is more my planner side, my planner hat.
Yeah.
How do you feel the governmental side dealt with the data collection piece? Because if they're collecting the wrong piece of data, no matter how often they collect it, it's still the wrong piece of data. How did people do? And presumably the state has more resources to throw at a problem like that than a locality might. What was your sense of that part of the process of the issue?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll say on the small business side, it is always challenging. And, I'll give an anecdote, which is I worked at the city of Boston. And one of my colleagues said one of the most embarrassing phone calls he ever got was from the mayor saying, "How many businesses do we have in Boston?" And he said, I don't know. And that partly on the small business side is a challenge of what they're required to report. So they're required, obviously, to register with, register their business with the city clerk's office. They're not required to report when they close, for example. And so even business lists are tricky, right? So that's on the small business side. On the unemployment side, we were able to get much better data. And that is obviously because it goes, right through the state and federal level in terms of unemployment reporting. And the state was then started to put out numbers by municipality, which was crucial because then the municipalities could say, I have 50 people who are receiving unemployment benefits right now. I really need to start to think about how I can target those people. So that was a project we did with a number of communities, really helping them understand what the data were saying to them about the needs in their community, and then also how to get those folks retrained back into work.
Yeah, no, it's also fascinating. So let's keep going on your strategy shift. You said the goals stayed the same, the strategies changed radically, and then what I would like to do with you is to get into the local economic recovery piece, which you sort of hinted at a couple of times. And I'd like to spend a time in that, but let's get through your strategy shift and the SEDS. Keep us going on that one.
Great. So we did a big lit review around these major themes of wages and kind of workforce, who's participating in the workforce. Wealth creation was a big question. And I'll say one of the things that really shifted for us last year was, we thought about wealth creation first around home ownership and business ownership. And, we could have an hours-long conversation about home ownership as a wealth generation tool. I think business ownership, as I was just saying, last year really called into question that as a strategy for wealth creation.
Well, let's spend a second on that. What did you find out? So there are a lot of businesses. I think in a prior conversation, I talked about a pizza shop. Presumably there's not a lot of wealth creation there. There's a job and there's income that comes out of that, but there's nothing really to hand off to the next generation, I assume. I don't know. What did you find on the wealth creation side?
Yeah, and again, the stats, even getting revenue figures for small businesses is more challenging, but we did, there's some national data, particularly looking at business ownership backgrounds and their ability to generate wealth. And certainly Black-owned businesses just have much less wealth generation capacity. And so for us, really thinking about racial equity, we then started saying, again, we don't want to lose businesses that bring cultural value and a sense of place, sense of well-being, and pride to a business owner, but also we want to make sure that those are really generating wealth. And a lot of businesses either, they don't have a track record of kind of robust customers, the ability to access additional financing to grow. So we started really saying, is business ownership, certainly there are strategies to help businesses scale, and thinking about contracting with major institutions and kind of more sustainable customer base. But then we said, what are the other things that people will need in order to generate wealth? So thinking about assets, how do we help people kind of have some more solid investments, or even children's savings accounts, right, to help people generate wealth over the course of their life, so that they can then pass on their wealth to future.
So these are the actual strategies themselves. So if say let's take that pizza shop. Let's take a pizza shop. That's really not creating anything extra. It's keeping people employed. It's keeping money coming into the household of the people there, the owners. But there's really not a lot of wealth creation there. You developed a whole set of strategies where that pizza shop owner, maybe the employees can sort of climb up the economic ladder. Is that correct? Is that accurate?
Yeah. And I'll talk about a few of them. They were a little bit broader, and I think we would need to then kind of parse through how do we help that particular business. But I'll just say here's a few off the top of my head. So one, and again, based on kind of the strategy that we created. If you look at that business, one of the questions is, can you make that business model more efficient? So are there ways that government intervention or kind of small business providers could help them reduce their expenses, right? Improve their accounting systems, or that's kind of on the technical system side. The second is, how do you help them increase their revenue? So this is marketing support. Last year in particular, a lot of communities, their response to that was, let's help get as many restaurants outside, being able to do outdoor vending and dining. But then the third is, are there other strategies that we can use to help this business owner generate wealth? So that is either kind of government income supports, the earned income tax credit and expanding that, but then also, can we help that person maybe buy their own building? Can we help that person even maybe think about changing their business model so that it becomes a worker-owned co-op or something where that's been shown to kind of have more wealth generation capacity over time? All of those things I think need to go in. I think traditionally we've thought about kind of individual business assistance and helping that business grow. And I think we need to think about the full business owner and their capacity to generate wealth over time.
All right. If it's okay with you, we're going to jump to economic recovery. So in March, April, you saw a 90% drop off of business activity is my statement. Maybe you can correct any part of this. I assume we're sort of still in that mode. I mean, there's always been this push-pull, and this show never talks about our national political discussions, but this was in effect one of the core debates going on about economic recovery versus public health and how those two might interplay.
Yeah.
My own back of the envelope sense is that there is more economic activity. You go into a store now, there are actually people lined up outside. But what about this whole economic recovery piece? You mentioned that bit about retail food establishments and the idea that you would move them physically outdoors, which has all by itself its own planning component to it. You have to make the streets available to do that. Walk us into that in the Massachusetts context, in the Boston regional context.
Perfect. And our agency actually was really involved in what we call shared streets. And it's just this concept of how can we get everybody to use the streets equally. And I'll just say, again, it's cliched, but a lot of people kind of said out of crisis comes opportunity. I certainly don't want to say that, I wish we didn't have to go through the last year to get to where we are. And also there were certain elements of creativity that happened. And one was around the shared streets. When I was previously working with businesses, it would take about 1.5 years to get all the permits and everything set for a business to operate outdoors. And I think probably in the past year, it took a couple weeks for businesses to get set up outside. And that was just an appetite, I think, for municipal leaders of saying we need to be creative. Certainly regulations and things are set up for public health and safety, but can we tweak those a little bit so that we can help these businesses stay afloat? And what ended up happening, and I know some of the viewers, I'm sure you're saying you saw it in your neighborhoods, it then, you had businesses operating outdoors. There was a sense of people kind of being out and about. We were just talking about a restaurant in my neighborhood that kind of had a beautiful, outdoor eating area. And it was just like, it was perfect, and there's something about sitting on the street and kind of reclaiming the street as you eat. So I think that kind of was a, silver lining, if you will. But that was really the lifeline for a lot of restaurants of kind of really helping them to be able to survive. I think from a planning perspective, the challenge was how do you support the other businesses that are there that would have more barriers to getting their activity out on the street? So there was some thinking about retail and kind of how do you bring the retail out? But I know some communities really kind of struggled with, we want to support the restaurants, but also there's other types of businesses that we really want to support. And how do we do that most effectively?
What else have you seen out there that's noteworthy?
So I think, unfortunately, we're going to see more business closures right now. And this then gets to this bigger conversation that folks have been having about downtown revitalization. What do we do in the face of, 10, 15% vacancy rates? I have seen, again, some businesses that have said, this is actually my opportunity to start. And that is partly because maybe they're seeing potentially commercial rental rates could go down, or they were able to develop a business model during COVID. They didn't have to adapt. And so they're already setting up a business with COVID kind of already factored into their business model around takeout or different ways that they're running their business. But I think we're still in for a long, long haul. And this is where, again, infusions of capital have helped. But I think there needs to be more around direct assistance for businesses to help them shift their business models.
Let me ask you on two things as we get towards our wrap up on this conversation. One is rental rates, which you mentioned just then. Presumably lack of demand or lessened demand or slack in demand means that prices go down. That's Econ 101, if Econ 101 is correct. I'm curious what you've seen there. And the other thing that we haven't really talked about much are large businesses. There are plenty of large employers around here, including the universities, which is an interesting component. They are actually huge players in the regional economy here. And while we often think of universities as immune to a lot of the ups and downs that everybody else faces, that's not been so much the case, I think, with COVID. COVID is a virus. It impacts everybody.
Right.
Just 20 seconds on each of those, if you can.
Sure. I know that. So, I think on the commercial rental rates, we'll see. I think a lot of folks were in long-term leases. And so I don't know whether the commercial rents are going to go down that much. We'll see. We'll see how things play out. But I think there could be some creativity. Also, as you mentioned, municipalities started being more creative about their regulations. And so that could kind of open up new options for businesses. On the large business side, we saw significant unemployment in the education sector. And that was one of the reasons why Massachusetts was hit so hard with unemployment, was just our reliance on kind of the healthcare sector and also education. But, again, I think there's some creativity in the kind of larger businesses that are really thinking about their role. How do we attract talent and develop the talent that's here? How do we retrain folks? So I think, and even like the remote work environment, I think we're going to see how that plays out over time, but that could actually afford some opportunities around the housing market and kind of office space market. It could also allow us to hire folks from other regions of the country where they stay put, but they're working in companies here, which I think could be really interesting.
Can you point people, how would people, if people want to find out more about the said study,
Sure.
And or communicate with you and MAPC about strategies and ways to address some of these things, where do they go? Where can people find out more about all this stuff?
It's pretty easy. It's mapc.org, which is our website. So Metropolitan Area Planning Council, mapc.org. And then there's a link about our work. And on our economic development page, we have this comprehensive economic development strategy. We have our work on expanding digital access around the region, which is something we didn't get a chance to talk about, but folks can check that out because that's a big element of economic recovery. And then all of the other recent plans and work that we're doing, you can find that on our website.
Sadly, I say, Betsy Cowan Neptune, Metropolitan Area Planning Council, economic development, economic recovery, the said study. We have just scratched the surface.
Right.
The digital divide is a whole topic.
A whole other thing. We could spend an hour talking about that, but grateful for this show and just, I know it started under COVID, so it's exciting to see again creativity and things that are happening despite and maybe because of what's happening. So kudos to you.
Well, I hope maybe we can get you back on sometime soon to talk
Likewise.
more about some of these topics.
All right. Thank you.